is going to be a recording of the rest of, I think it's chapter 14. It's really bright here today. Is it okay? The rest of the chapter on plants. So what does it look like is going on in these pictures? Pollination. And what's happening in pollination?
The male reproductive organ is being transferred to the female reproductive organ by another insect or species or
So some insect, bat, or bird is picking up pollen off of the anthers and transferring it from one flower to another. Does that sound about right? So you're moving pollen from place to place in order to fertilize the eggs. And what do plants use in order to get pollinators to visit them?
Smell.
Smell is one thing that's going to cue them in. This might be something good. Color is another one. And some of it is colors that we can see. Some of it are colors we can't see, especially for bats and a number of species of insects. Plants actually have colors that are seen in ultraviolet radiation. So we can't see them, but under a UV light, we can find them. But what is the payoff? What does the hummingbird or the bat or the insect get from the flower?
Nectar.
Nectar. So they visit, they're going to obtain the nectar, and they're then going to move on to the next flower where they get more nectar, but they drop off their pollen. Because what happens is that certain pollinators are meant for certain flowers. And they have body parts that will pick up the pollen in one flower, but then as they go to feed from the next, they will transport it. Like the honeybee. There are these little places on their legs where they'll pick up the pollen, and then as they move to the next flower and they settle down, it's going to fall off of their legs, and it's going to then fertilize the flower. So the flower gives up nectar in order to get pollination occurring.
Is that a bat in the forward?
That is a bat. Bats are pollinators as well, especially of plants that flower at night. Bats are a really great pollinator for that. A lot of your fruit bats and things like that can be pollinators. And that means that bats may also pollinate flowers that we don't think smell good, because really bad smells can travel for long distances and can help to trap them at night. Yeah, bats can be pollinators.
Interesting.
There are also beetles that like the smell of rotting flesh, so there's a couple flowers that have adapted the smell of rotting flesh as their fragrance. I cannot imagine. So sexual reproduction in plants involves the production of pollen grains as the male gamete, and embryo sacs with eggs as the female gamete. And then pollination is that movement of the pollen grain of a plant to an embryo sac of a plant. Sometimes there's self-fertilization, meaning that the pollen is going to fertilize the flower it came from. We talked about with the peas that this often happens in the pea experiment, that's how peas normally fertilize. Cross-pollination is when you're pollinated by a different flower. And most of our angiosperms are going to use animals to carry out their pollination. Whether those animals are insects or whether they are birds or bats, or even sometimes you, as you brush by something and then you move and brush by that plant again, you could actually move its pollen. Deer can do this. Dogs, as they run through a field, can help with pollination. And pollination appears to be related to the diversification of flowers, because certain flowers are going to have matches to certain pollinators. And there is this mutualistic relationship. In a mutualistic relationship, it's where two things are involved, two or more, and both are benefiting. So in a mutualistic relationship for pollinators, the pollinator, the insect, the bird, the bat, gets nectar. It's getting something. It's a positive thing that it's getting. And the flower is also getting something positive. It's getting pollinated. So it's moving its pollen around and it is getting pollinated. So they're both benefiting from this relationship. You've probably heard the word before, parasite, right? Some of you, or you've heard it referred to for people, because we use that for people too, that somebody is a parasite on your life, or that you have a disease and it's actually a parasite disease. In a parasite relationship, one thing is benefiting and the other thing is being harmed. But in a mutualistic relationship, both things are benefiting. We'll talk more about that in either chapter 19 or 20. There are over, as I mentioned last time, 240,000 flowering plants, but there's over 700,000 species of insects. Many things can pollinate certain flowers. Others have very specific types of relationships where there's only a handful of things that pollinate them well. What we're finding, though, is that some pollinators are currently on decline. How many of you knew that the bee population was currently declining? Are you concerned about it?
Yes.
Because bees pollinate a ton of crops for us and a lot of things. Ben and Jerry's started a education campaign, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago now, about caring about bee populations because of one very important ingredient in ice cream. Does anyone know what ingredient it is that they're worried about? It's clearly not milk.
Honey.
Not honey, although that will be impacted.
Wheat?
Nope.
Is it like beeswax?
No. Vanilla. Vanilla is pollinated by bees. There are other things that are pollinated by bees as well. And the concern is that there are some things that we can't pollinate in other ways, at least not easily and not cost effectively. And vanilla is a really big concern with pollination, that it is pollinated naturally. Because vanilla is a seed pod. So our bee populations are declining. We know that they are. Why they're declining becomes problematic. Hold on. Restart later. The computer's like, would you like to restart and install updates? No. It restarts on us. Well, we'll figure it out. But insecticides was the first thing that we thought, okay, well, we're putting out insecticides and that's killing insects. Maybe that's affecting bees. And in some parts it is. Maybe herbicides, though, the things that are killing off weeds. Or maybe pesticides in general, that whole category that also includes things that kill off rats. We're realizing that's part of it, but there also seems to be disease too. And we have found that the more threatened an animal is, the more likely it is to be impacted by disease. Think about that in human terms. When are you most likely to get sick? When you're already stressed out and not sleeping enough? So the same thing is going to be true of these insects. When are they more likely to catch a disease? When their bodies are already stressed, which might be because they've been exposed to insecticides or something. So the same. And there's a very weird thing that angiosperms do. Very weird. At least I think it's weird. It's also kind of cool. They do a process called double fertilization. So this is when there are two things that are going to be fertilized. There's the egg that's going to develop into the baby plant, but the food source also is going to be included in this fertilization process. And that food source is the cotyledon. What you think is the cotyledon? The term for whether it's a 1 or a 2 cotyledon for that entire structure is when it's in the seed. So before it becomes the cotyledon with the baby plant, when it's still in the seed, it's called the endosperm. So it's a nutritious tissue that's also going to be the result of double fertilization. Double fertilization gives us the endosperm, which develops into the cotyledons, and it also gives us our baby plant. So then your seed contains 3 things. 1, the baby plant, the embryo. to the stored food, which is the endosperm. And when the plant eventually breaks forth from the seed, we call it the cotyledons, because there are going to be little leaves that are going to grow and they're going to take up the endosperm nutrition. And then there's the seed coat, or that outer covering of the seed that develops from the ovule, where the egg was. So those are the three things that make up a seed. And here we have that double fertilization, where fertilization results in the fertilization through the pollen tube, as well as through the embryo itself, and you get your seed, which looks like this. This is a pretty easy picture. I feel like this could be on a test and you guys would get all the parts. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things on it. So maybe we'll have a seed picture on exam 3. What do we think? We can handle that. There's only 5 things. And it'll be the cartoon version, not the picture version. But I like that you can see the structures here. So there's the seed coat, that outer covering of a seed. There's the immature leaves of the baby plant. There's the hypocotyl, which is going to become the stem of the plant. And then there's the radicle, which is going to become the root of the plant. So that immature leaf, hypocotyl, and radicle are all the parts of the embryo. And then the rest is that stored food. How many of you have ever opened a peanut and you've seen that it has that little like thing on the one side that's not on the other side? That's the baby plant inside the peanut. So that would develop into the plant. That rest of it is the stored food. It's the same thing if you open up a bean pod. You can see the little seeds in there. If you open them up, you might be able to find the baby plant. How much of this seed does it look like to you is the plant versus how much is stored food?
All of it is stored food.
Almost all of it is stored food. And that's because the plant has no way of getting nutrition up until it's able to then break through the ground surface and start growing and start doing photosynthesis. And even then, how much photosynthesis does a tiny little plant do? Not very much. So even when it's still growing at first, it's still going to have that stored food left in order to keep it going until it gets large enough to do enough photosynthesis to support itself. So that stored food is going to make the difference between that baby plant surviving and not surviving. But when we think of a lot of things that we eat, we think of the fruit portion that comes from plants. And in this way, this word fruit is more than just fruit or vegetable. It's actually going to be inclusive of a lot of vegetables at this step. The fruit is going to contain the ripened ovary, which has the zygote, that plant inside of it. And the role of fruit is to help protect the seed, but it's also going to increase seed dispersal. How does it increase seed dispersal? So that fruit is that covering of the angiosperm seed. It protects it, and it's going to help with dispersal. How can things be dispersed, meaning that they're moved away from where their parent is? How can a seed be moved?
I think it talks about like animals coming and eating the fruit.
That's one way. How about maple seeds? How do they get dispersed? Wind. Absolutely. So they have that little kind of flange on the seed that's going to help move it. It's going to spin as it falls down. So animals can help. Wind. Water and gravity are two other ways. Gravity is going to, of course, bring it to the ground, and it may fall sideways. Wind's going to move things a lot. why might you want your seed moved away if you were a plant? Or why does dispersal even happen for plants? Why is it important?
So they can like grow in different areas.
You want to move to a different area? Maybe your area is overcrowded where the plant is. So dispersal helps move the seed to a less crowded area. Maybe it's not the best condition. Like maybe a plant has been able to live there for a long time because it was established, but now it's an area that gets less rainfall. So the seed's going to be dispersed someplace else where it can withstand the conditions. And when that plant arrives, or when the seed arrives, the plant that's inside of it is going to have everything that it needs in order to live in a new location that is hospitable to it. So as long as it has the right soil, the right water, the right nutrients, it'll survive because the entire plant is inside of there. What's going to be its roots are there, what's going to be the leaves are there, everything is there for it to start growing right away. This poor dog in this picture is covered in those little sycamore balls that stick to you as you run through an area. Has that happened to any of you? Where they stick to your clothes? That really helps in their dispersal, right? Because when you get to a new location, you just kind of like shake it off and you try and like get it off of your clothing, but now it's completely in a different place than it was where it started. That's a really useful way to get your seeds to a totally new location. In this picture, you cannot see it really well, but there is a mouse who is eating berries. Eventually, the mouse is going to defecate the seeds from those berries, and they're going to be moved someplace else entirely. Not only will the seeds be someplace new, but they will be with fertilizer, which will actually help them grow even better. Because as the mouse defecates, there's fecal matter, and what do we use as fertilizer? Manure, right? So it'll be mouse manure as opposed to cow manure. Be a form of fertilizer for it, though. Dandelions. Wind is their main source of spreading their seed around, or small children. There are a couple different types of fruits. It's worth mentioning the dry fruits versus the fleshy fruits. Dry fruits are not things you think of as fruit. They're things you probably think of as a seed. So this would be things like wheat and nuts. It's something that at maturity, it's dry on the inside. So it's the opposite of like an apple or an orange. And there are two types of dry fruits, dehiscent and indehiscent. In the dehiscent one, it's going to split open the seed pod and it will release the seeds. They'll just kind of fall out. In the indehiscent, it's not going to split open, or even if it does, the seed is not going to be automatically just released. And I'll show you a picture of what these look like in a moment. But it's worth mentioning that that's not just a seed, that there is a fruit there even if we don't think of it as a fruit. But the fleshy fruits are what we generally think of as a fruit. And the flesh does not just come from a single part of the flower. It may come from multiple parts. And different ones have different types of the flower or different parts of the flower that develop into the fleshy part. Those that are a stone fruit, so things like a peach, a plum, nectarine, those where they have that hard covering, like a pit in the middle, that pit is because the endocarp actually hardens as the fruit is developing. So the flesh is going to be all around that, but the seeds are actually contained inside of that pit structure. Peas are a dry fruit, and they're a dehiscent fruit. When pea pods are completely dried, if you split it open, the peas are just going to tumble right out. The opposite of that is a maple tree fruit. Who has ever, I doubt you did in lab, but you probably did as a little kid, tried to dissect these little maple tree seeds? You can break them and you could chew them, but can you peel the skin off of that seed structure and keep it intact? No. Even if you do peel it off, it's just peeling off a layer and the seed is still inside of there. But you can actually peel off that seed coat. And then you can get the little seed and it just looks exactly the same. So this is going to be a dry, indehiscent one. meaning that when you split that open, the seed's not going to fall out, that seed is going to be firmly attached to that covering. And then fruits get even more complicated. A few more terms for talking about fruit. We can have simple fruits or aggregate or multiple fruits. There's a number of different types of fruits that we can have. In a simple fruit situation, the fruit develops. Okay. In a simple fruit situation, the fruit develops from the ovary or carpel of one plant, or an ovary that contains several carpels. So it's developing basically from one flower and from the parts that are in the carpel. An accessory fruit, there's parts other than the ovary that are going to make up the fruit. So maybe the petals or other parts of the flower structure are going to be involved in creating the fruit. An aggregate fruit is kind of the opposite of a simple fruit. It's a fruit made from many different carpels, many different individual carpels. A multiple fruit, and there's a few of these that can happen, come from many flowers that all combine to eventually make a single fruit. Both aggregate and multiple fruits are examples of compound fruits, where they are coming from multiple different types. So strawberries, I think, are pretty safe to say are a fleshy fruit, correct? And where are the seeds of a strawberry?
On the outside.
On the outside. Most fruits you probably learned in elementary school, the seeds are on the inside, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Not true for strawberries, not true for a lot of other things that we're going to talk about. But the fruit portion is on the outside. The flesh is actually from the receptacle. So there's lots of different ovaries that are involved in this one strawberry fruit, because each of those little yellow dots on the outside is a separate seed. Raspberries are an aggregate fruit. The fruit comes from the ovary of a single flower, or all the ovaries from one flower. So one flower gives birth to a raspberry, even though it's going to have lots of little individual structures making up the shape of the raspberry. Once you have a seed, when does the baby plant start growing? Does it start right away?
No.
No. Yeah, usually. It needs to have the right conditions in order to start growing. Because what do you think might happen if a tulip started trying to grow in December?
Would die
Why?
because it's too cold, not warm enough.
Too cold, it's not warm enough. One other really big thing.
Water treatment.
A couple really big things then. Yep.
Sunlight.
Sunlight. Frozen water. Too short of a day. We talked about why leaves change color, right? Do you remember why leaves change color?
There's less sun.
It's less sun.
Isn't it like there's less chlorophyll?
There's less chlorophyll because it's expensive to make chlorophyll. So you have to have enough sunlight to offset the cost of that chlorophyll. And once the day gets too short, you don't have enough sunlight. That chlorophyll is too expensive to keep making, so the plant's going to stop making it. And it won't grow. So when your plants start to grow and they start becoming a seedling, they need to have the right conditions. That process of going from seed to seedling is called germination. And that's going to happen when there's enough water, enough warmth, enough oxygen, and this one's not up there, but also enough sunlight. Without enough sunlight, it's not going to happen. The time that that plant spends as a seed is called dormancy. And there's no growth happening then. The plant can still be using perhaps the stored food that's in there to keep itself alive, but it's not actively growing. The plant itself is not getting any bigger. It's just this little tiny plant inside of a seed. And plants may go through dormancy for a long period of time. Even if conditions are good for growth, it doesn't mean they're going to start to grow. Has anyone ever bought a packet of seeds at the hardware store or the grocery store? Have any of you ever forgotten about them for a year and then gone to plant them the next year?
No.
They might still grow then. Sometimes they won't because they've been around too long and they've used up all their stored food. But that extra year that they're spending in that seed pouch, that might not affect their ability to grow. They're not growing then. They're not becoming another plant then. But then when you plant them, the conditions could have been completely favorable, but they weren't planted, so they wouldn't start growing. And some plants need to sense certain things in order to grow. Some seeds need to sense that something has gone through a freezing and a thawing time period. Some need to sense the timing of daylight and a certain length of daylight. Some need to sense water, that they've had a time where they've been soaked and then suddenly they start to dry out. They say, okay, now it must be time to grow. You heard, I imagine when you were little, that April showers bring May flowers. And it is true that rainstorms can help trigger seeds to grow. So having multiple events of being wet and then dry and wet and then dry can trigger plants to start growing, just like the changing daylight can. In a lot of plants that are found in deserts, a soaking rain for them is the trigger to start making flowers. So plants are going to be well attuned to what's happening in their environment so they're reacting appropriately. And when the seed starts to grow into a plant, it's going to break through its seed coat. The little plant is going to unfold and come out through the top. The radicle is going to be pointed downwards because it's going to become the roots. The hypocotyl is going to come up through the surface, and it's going to bend upwards, and then the epicotyl, or those baby leaves, are going to face upwards. And as it starts to grow, you will see these weird structures left there. Those are the cotyledons. They're going to look a little different than the leaves. They're going to be what is left of the stored food. And the plant is going to use that up until it is capable of living on its own, which is basically about as much time as the cotyledons will last. They may look more like actual leaves than they do in this picture, but they are going to still resemble the shape of the seed. Plant's going to form multiple buds that are going to come off of this vegetative reproduction, which is similar to cloning, type of asexual reproduction, and the offspring is going to look exactly like the parent. Have any of you ever tried to pick clover? What happened when you tried to pick the clover?
Oh, like I've been like trying to find them. I couldn't find them. Never like actually.
Have you ever tried to pick up a clover plant? Or a wild strawberry? What happens with a wild strawberry?
It's like a web underneath.
It's like a web. Same is true of clover. So you start pulling it up, what you start realizing is it's not just this little plant. It's going all over the place. That's because they have stolons. We'll see pictures of what each of these look like. But some of these plants have stems that are above the ground that they'll put a plant here. The stem will grow a little bit. It's going to grow a new plant. Stem grows a little bit, grows a new plant, and so on. So you may have 15, 20 different plants, or what look like different plants to you, that are all connected to a single stem that goes around along the ground surface. If it's above the ground, we call it a stolon. If it's below the ground, we call it a rhizome. So that stem grows and it goes, oh, look, there's no competition here. Make a plant. Grows a little bit further, makes another plant. These are all genetically identical, and they're all part of one single plant, even though they look like they're very little, lots of plants.
Is this what occurs like with like Christmas cactuses? Do you know, like, so like when a Christmas cactus dies, do you know, like, you can take like a part of the Christmas cactus and replant it, and then it'll start growing again?
Not the same exact thing, but related. Same thing is true. So Christmas cactus, you can take a part of it and you can root it.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing is true of a African violet plant, that you can take a leaf and you can form roots from that. That's actually because plants are, the word is totipotent, meaning that any cell has, or that a cell has the ability to become lots of different types of cells. So the cells in their leaves can actually, given the right conditions, become like roots.
Okay.
So it's a little different than that, but if you do put the Christmas cactus in water, it will suddenly develop roots. Same thing is true of a African violet. And while we're on both of those, when you water a Christmas cactus or an African violet, should you get the leaves wet? Definitely not with an African violet. If you have had no luck with African violets, it's probably because you're getting their leaves wet all of the time. You actually want to be sure you get the soil and not the leaves. I learned that in grad school from one of the librarians who had the most massive collection of African violets. And you had to pass like a quiz, a written quiz, in order for her to give you an African violet. And that was part of it. She was very protective of them. She must have had 25 different varieties of them on her desk. It was insane, but amazing. She retired from being the librarian of a Christian school and then became the librarian of my grad campus. She'd been an elementary school librarian for like 25 years and then retired and went to work at a university. And her passion were African violets. Anyone eat potatoes? Sweet potatoes, regular potatoes, carrots?
Yes.
So sometimes you'll find that part of a carrots is not true of, but potatoes, this is true of. They're tubers. They're actually part of an enlarged rhizome that's stored. Here's our strawberry plants with their stolon. It's like a little vine, green vine that grows across the bottom, right on top of the soil, and every so often puts up a new plant. It's pretty fabulous. And here we have the rhizomes, the tubers, and the corm structure. The roots all come off of them, and they can give birth to multiple plants. With some of your plants that come from bulbs, you may hear people talk about splitting plants, where they'll take a shovel and they'll cut down the middle or cut it into fourths and split it up. That will work with these plants that have this corm structure, because as long as it has part of that base, part of the green stuff, and part of these adventitious roots, it will regrow. You can learn a lot about plants from your local garden center, or the person in your neighborhood that has the best garden could probably teach you more about plants than you would ever want to know. For some of you, they will teach you everything you want to know about plants. If you want to have a good garden, the most important thing you can do is talk to people in your neighborhood that have a really nice garden, and they can tell you all of the things you need to do. Or find a really supportive Facebook group or something. But Pinterest will probably not give you the information you need. It's a shame.
You ever see the movie The Martian?
No, I have not.
It's like, basically somebody, like, they've been, like, doing trips to Mars, and, like, basically he gets stuck on Mars by himself, and, like, all he has is, like, potatoes, and stuff like that. So, and he's trying to figure out how he can, like, basically make enough food for him to, like, survive for, like, 2 or 3 years until the next, like, trip, like, comes to save him and rescue him. And so, he, like, starts, taking the potatoes and replanting them. Yeah.
A lot of potatoes.
A lot, yeah.
Can you survive on potatoes alone?
I mean, there was other food, but, like, potatoes was the one thing he could grow up there.
They have a lot of nutrients.
Yeah. It was a long movie. Movie.
So this is another way of looking at those stems. Leaves, it's also worth mentioning, are highly variable. Cacti, those needles, are modified leaves. Pine trees, the pine needles, leaves. Leaves. So leaves have a variety of forms. The job of the root is to anchor the plant to the ground surface. It also is where the absorption of water and nutrients, so things like nitrogen and fertilizers, are going to be absorbed through the roots. The root will also store food during the summer and then give the food back to the plant during the winter. And there's a lot of different types of roots. There's the fibrous roots, which we're used to thinking about as a root. This is what most of your grasses and your monocots have. Then there's things like a carrot, which are a taproot. Turnips are also taproots. The root, as it grows, has a structure called a root cap. It's a very tough structure compared to the rest of the root. And it's kind of similar to your shoelace. Has that portion that's wrapped in wax or something to go through easily as you're lacing your shoe. That's so that the root itself is protected as it grows deeper in the soil. And rhizome structures will have roots that grow off of them. And this is in case you ever see these words and want to know what they mean. Annuals are plants that do their life cycle in 1 year or less. Biennials complete their life cycle in 2 years. So if you plant an annual, it's likely to be there for that year, may not be there another year. Biennial is probably going to come back the next year, and if you're lucky, it's going to go to seed, and there'll be more of it coming up in your garden. Around here, sometimes annuals will come back every year, but they're usually things you have to plant every year. Perennials are those that are going to usually have a bulb, or they're a tree. There's something that's going to come back year after year after year after year. So if you're looking to plant your garden and have things that'll come back every year and not need much effort from you for planting, you want to be sure you're planting all perennials.